Okay, everybody, welcome to our demo for today. And today is going to be about routers. Now, this is not basically a router class. This is to show you the things you can and cannot do with routers, how neat they are, and how essential they are to really a good operation in your shop, and safe practices and unsafe practices. The most popular router in this country today is this. This is part of the Porter Cable 6. We have is an electric motor, and attached to the electric motor is a collet, which is where we put the router bits. This is a 1/2-inch collet, which means a collet with a 1/2-inch shank goes in here. You use the nuts to tighten everything down. When we turn this on, it's at full speed. We cannot adjust the speed. All we can do is turn it off, turn it on. This rotates at 22,000 RPM, which means if you have a cutting head that's got 2 blades on it, in 1 minute, those 2 blades have gone through the wood 22,000 times. Wood's been cut 44,000 times. Very fast. It does an excellent job. But this is a gyroscope. Once this thing gets going, you have to have a good firm hold on it. The bases are normally this is called a fixed base. In other words, the base doesn't move. And what we would do is we would put the base on with a router bit in here. We would adjust this until the bit was poking out the height we wanted, and then we lock it in. And now we can take this and go around the edge of a board. We can't plunge. All we can do is go around the edges. We can cut a dado going through the middle as long as it's supported on both sides. But that's basically it. A fixed base lets us do this, but we couldn't come in here and really do that safely. You can try to do this, but then you'd much better with a plunge base. So, a plunge base looks like this. Now, this is a Festool router. This is a smaller router. This is comparable to this in power. This base is a little bit better. It's got a vacuum port that comes with it. This doesn't. This is going to throw stuff everywhere. And to make this plunge, we turn the handle to loosen. So now we can come over the spot. We can actually press this down, bring it back up, and make a nice, neat hole. That's how these things are made. These holes in this tabletop. A router came over, punched down, came up, just like that. Again, now I can punch through here, I can bring it this way, I can go around stuff. So this is much more versatile. It's a little bit more expensive, but in your shop with your router, I would recommend that you have both types of bases, because there'll be some times when you want to ground the edges that this is perfect. There'll be other times when you need to make a plunge cut, like a mortise cut or a tenon cut or something like that, and this is perfect. Ideally, with a router, you want variable speed. This is a variable speed control here. This doesn't have one. You also want a soft start, especially if you're going to hand hold it. When you turn this on, you go from 0 to 100 like that. So this will literally twist in your hands. But what's one thing you know already when you turn this on? You don't want to hold it up here, because now I've only got one hand to hit the on and off switch. Well, I really want it on a table. But remember, now this router is poking, the bit's poking out. So to start this safely, I have to be over here. And one of the things you'll notice about routers is this. Especially on the edges, 2/3 of the router base is in air. Only 1/3 on the table. So you really need to have a good hold on it. Now, if I was going to use this router and do this edge here, should I push the router this way or should I push the router this way? Well, this is what that means is it comes through here, it's going to hit the wood this way and chip the wood out here. If I'm going like this, that bit's going to hit it. I'm going in the same direction. It's going to jump out of my hands. So we want to make it go in the opposite direction. So in this case, if you're hand holding, you always want to go from left to right. If you go over here, you're still going left to right. If you're going to cut this part out, now the edge is on the other side of the router bit. Here it's on this side of the router bit. Here it's on this side. Which way should I push it here? The opposite way. So if I'm doing an inside cut, it's right to left. If I'm doing an outside, it's left to right. If I'm on a router table, I flip this upside down. Now this is going the opposite way, right? So I flip it upside down. So whenever you're doing a router table, the wood always goes from right to left. You always want to make sure, have to make sure, that when you use a router table and you use a fence, it's got to be wood bit fence. Never, ever, ever have it bit wood fence, because you're going to cut your fingers off. Okay? That router bit's going to grab it, it's going to throw the wood that way at about 100 miles an hour, it's going to drag your hands right in there. You always want to have the wood first, then the router bit, then the fence. Okay? And you're always going to push the wood from right to left. Now, horsepower. This is 1 3/4 horses. There's another series, this is 690, the 890 series is also a 3-inch motor. That's 2 1/4 horse. And the big routers are 3 1/4 horsepower. The big routers are really weighty. And it's going to be exhausting, and it's easy to make mistakes, especially when most of that weight is over air and you're holding it. So I would save the big router motor. All router motors make great for handheld work. What kind of work can we do with the router? This is a raised panel door. Okay? That's an example from our raised panel door class. This type of router woodworking can only be done on a router table. And why is that? That's because it uses bits this size. This is a lot of steel, and this is a lot of speed at the tips. This can't be adjusted. So if I put this bit in this router and turn it on, at the tips, these would be going about 100 miles an hour. And if you try to hit a piece of wood with something going 100 miles an hour, you can't control it. It will hurt you severely. To make this work, you need 2 things. You need a router motor that's inside a bench like this, a table, and you need a motor that you can control the speed on. If I'm using this, I'm going to speed this down from 22,000 to about 11,000. Now this is much more controllable. So anytime you're using a router bit over 1 inch in diameter from side to side, you have to be able to turn the speeds down. That should also give you a good rule of thumb for when you need to put the router into a table. If you're going to use any bits over 1 inch in diameter, it's got to be in the table, because it's going to be really hard to control. Okay? Tables are easy. Once you start using a table, you never go back. These are great. So, what other things can we do with the router? This is a demo piece from our Router Magic class. When you go to the Router Magic class here, you learn how to cut grooves. Now, why would you cut a groove? Well, if you're doing cutting boards, you can turn it from a cutting board to a carving board. And this is either called a juice groove or a blood groove, depending if you are vegetarian or a meat eater. You can do inlay like this or inlay like this. So these are just some examples of what you can do, and you'll learn to do this in the Router Magic class. If you're really interested in learning about it, I would really recommend you take that class. Another very, very popular use for routers is these joints. This is a half-line dovetail. This is a very popular box joint. It's even more popular drawer joint to hold a drawer together. But that makes it, using the router and a jig, you can just crank these out. It's very easy, very repeatable. And this is what you want. That joint serves two purposes. One, it's self-squaring. Two, not only do you have the glue holding it together, you actually have a mechanical lock, the shape of the wood. The wood can't go through itself. That is the strongest joint in the world, is that one. So that's a very, very, when you start putting that into your woodworking, you're doing outstanding. Another thing that you can do with a router is you can make boxes. This is made with what we call box joints. Very easy to cut on the router. And this top was made on the router. See how it slides? So this groove was cut in the board before it was assembled, and this groove was cut in the top with the router before it was assembled. And inside there's just an example of a Dutchman. The top, if you're interested, the veneer was done with a drill press and a Forstner bit. But this example, that's very easy to do. This is done also with the router table. Here's another example of what you can do with a router. This is a footstool for an Adirondack chair. And what we did with this is we used the router to round over these edges so it would feel comfortable. We also use the router to do a through tenon. So this is actually held onto everything else through these tenons. So just one step above from using a little bit more elegant, take your woodworking to the next step. So routers can do this. And this was done with the domino, which is basically a horizontal router. You sit it down and the router bit comes out and goes side to side. So this is an example of what we can do. Now, this was done on the table. It was done on the table because it was convenient, because I can just sit here and just move the wood right through. If you're looking at router tables, what you're aware of is this plate. This plate is what holds the router to the table. There's two ways to do it. One way is you take this black piece off. You've got a plate here that's got the same screw holes, and they sell plates for particular routers. And you screw the plate onto the bases and the same screws that held this black piece on, and then the whole thing sits below. Then if you want to raise and lower it, you've got to reach under the table and literally twist the router until you get the height that you want. Lock it in place. Or you can buy one of these, and I've got one of these. This is called a router lift. And what you do is you just put the motor here. Router lift has these holders. You can see the screw holes in here that this screw goes all the way through. What you can't see in this black piece, there's also more. So using this screw and these holes, I can put 14 different size motors in here without a special adapter. It's huge. And then what you do once you've got this set up to raise and lower, to either cut or to change the bits, you just turn this and up it comes. Everything is right in front of you. It's incredibly safe. Holds the motor, doesn't let it twist or turn. You can just run through stuff here like Keen does a very great job. I highly recommend, if you're going to get a table, you invest the extra money and you get a lift. You're going to find it's much, much easier to do. Another thing you're going to find about routers are messy. They're extremely messy. So if you can, you want to have good dust collection. Here, we can get some dust collection from our fence. We can also build a cabinet around the base and put a dust hose in there, and you can collect top and bottom. So this, you can make this pretty efficient. You're still going to get dust. You're always going to get some. This in space by itself, lots and lots of shavings. Now, some systems, like this Festool system, are designed to work with their dust collection. And what we're going to do here is we're going to make this cut now. Some manufacturers do things that makes it easier for us to use their product. One of these people is Festool. Now, they're expensive, but they do this extra stuff. If you look around the base of this router, you'll see little lines. Those lines are where the very dead center of the router bit is going to go through the wood. All measuring that you do on wood, if you're going to cut in dados or things like that, you want to have a common point of reference. Most woodworkers use the dead center of the bit, because then it doesn't matter what size bit you have. The dead center spot is going to be the same on all of them. So if you measure to the dead center, you can get very consistent measurements time after time. So to turn this on, all I got to do is pull the trigger. Hear the vacuum come on. Plug the router into the vacuum and plug the vacuum into the wall. Anytime you start the tool, the vacuum's going to come on. We're going to plunge and cut. Now, what did I tell you about routers being messy? This has got some of the best dust collection in the world, and yet we still have a mess. Routers are always going to be messy. It's okay. We can live with that, especially when you have this system. We can do this. Yeah. Take this off. Always keep them unplugged unless you're going to use them. Now, what did we do? This is a dado cut. It's not very deep, but we don't need it to be very deep. Okay? What we want is nice, crisp, sharp edges, and we've got those. And if we're going to make a bookcase or a cabinet, what we do, now we'd hold this in place with glue and clamps and everything, but you can see this is a nice tight flush. This is how you want it. Now, if you put, this is a bookcase and we put books on here or pots and pans or anything, the weight that this is carrying goes to the edge and it goes straight down the board. So this is great, and you see that here, we're going to have glue to clamp it in here. That's enough that will hold that great. And then in addition to this, so we'd probably do stuff to hide the edges. So we would put some type of either veneer tape on here and glue it on, or we can actually cut wood and glue it to this to hide these. There's oodles of stuff that we can do. But this is an example of what you'd use a router for. How simple is that? That took seconds. We got a nice straight dado cut. Know the difference between a dado cut and a rabbit cut? Rabbit cut's on the side. If it's on the side, it's a rabbit. If it's in the wood, it's a dado. This is just a simple cut that we want to use. You don't need to be afraid of the router, but you really need to be mindful. You don't want to let your fingers anywhere near the blade. So this is the one that worries me most in the wood shop, is I'm teaching somebody to do something. Because as long as that motor's turning, you have to ignore everything else in the room and concentrate on that cutter. So if somebody opens the door and yells, "Hey, fire," well, what you want to do is turn off the router and make sure it stops, then run. Just don't leave it. Don't turn your back on it. Can you get a kickback from a router? Oh yeah. Yeah, certainly you can. What normally happens, especially if you're using a table, you just let go of the wood gets just ripped out of your hands, and you turn off the router and go inside and have a mixed drink because you're done for the day. If you're holding one of these puppies, you need to be real careful, because if you drop it, something happens, you're startled and you drop it, or you lose one hand, it starts to swing. You don't want that thing falling, because I guarantee if you drop it, it's gonna, when it falls, it's probably gonna come cutting side towards you. It always seems to work that way. So the bigger they get, the more powerful they get, the heavier they get. Again, this is the most popular one today. And that's probably one of the, except for trim routers. Trim routers are great. The smaller routers are called trim routers, and they're designed to do one thing and one thing only. So normally what happens is that they're called laminate trimmers. They're little bitty things about this big. They're nice and light, little square shape, and you put a piece of wood down that they can run against. And so you've glued laminate, or you've glued a veneer to a piece of plywood. You want to cut it flush. So that's what they're designed for. They do an excellent job. I also use them for mortise and hinges. I'll trace the hinge out, take that, hog out most of the wood with the trim router, then just use a chisel to take a little bit left over, and it works great. So those are 1/4 inch. They're full. Some of them have variable speed, but they're not designed for big bits. They're designed for small bits. They just don't have the horsepower to move a big bit. But little cutter bits, straight cutter bits, or spiral bits, they're outstanding. What else do we need now? Small cuts are better. If you're going to cut something on a router, you don't want to take a big bite. You would never, ever, ever, ever cut the whole piece of wood at one time with this. This one's on the top is called a back cutter. It's designed for these doors. And what this is going to give you is going to give you a little tongue poking out that's exactly 1/4 inch wide. So when you use a 1/4 inch bit to cut the groove, to put the door together, it fits in the slot perfectly. So with this one, we don't want to cut the whole piece of wood at one time because it's uncontrollable. So this one, we have a fence, and we hide this in the fence, so that when we first cut it, we only get a little bit. And then as we want more, we move the fence back 1/4 inch until it crosses the center line here. Now, because of this and the bearing here, it's going to stop. We won't be able to go any deeper. But that's how you do it. You bring the fence back, fence back, fence back, fence back. This type of bit is just the opposite. What we're going to do with this one is have this in the router table itself with just a little bit poking up. And we're going to cut, and then in here we've got a fence. There's a bearing right there that's going to make sure we can't go too far deep. So what we want to do with this one is cut it, raise it 1/4 inch, cut it, raise it 1/4 inch, cut it. You're going to find out that doing that, the router lift is a godsend. Otherwise, you're going to have to reach underneath, twist the whole thing, lock it in place, and do that every time. This cabinet, that cabinet, that cabinet, that cabinet are all full of different routers. Your choices are tremendous. Plus, you can mix and match bits. You can do stuff then make a unique profile by using one type of bit and another type of bit to shape the wood how you want. I use router bits for edge treatment all the time, especially in the chessboards I make. I use the lock miter bit, which it has to be on the table. And what a lock miter bit does is it cuts a perfect 45 and it makes a little dimple, a piece of wood coming out. And you cut on both pieces, and one piece is flat and one piece is vertical. When you put them together, they're dead flat 90 degrees, they interlock, you put glue on there, and it's an incredibly strong joint. Your joints are tough to do because you've got end grain on both sides. So glue doesn't like, well, most woodworking glues is water-based. End grain was designed by nature to suck out water. You can actually take tight bond glue, run over the edge of end grain, and watch it, and you can see within 30 seconds to a minute the glue disappears. That's because the wood sucked all the water in and brought the glue with them. So it's very, very common in miter joints, which people like for boxes and stuff, that the joint's very weak. That's why you see them using splines and biscuits and dados and all kinds of things. What the lock miter does is it presents some side grain. And side grain is where you get the strongest glue joint. And it's enough bring together. So it does a very good job. And that way, if you've got a box and you've got beautiful grain and structure and you want it to wrap around the whole box, that's why you use a miter joint. If you don't care about that, then you can use box joints, you can use most anything that you want. But if you've got some really beautiful wood that like you want to do it, you've seen waterfall cabinets and stuff like that, same thing. You just want that grain of flow interrupted. That means you're gluing a miter joint with end grain and you want to do splines or something, which is fairly easy with these routers. Any questions?